Welcome back, life science learners, to our final bit of today. In our lesson, we're focusing on the process of digestion, where special emphasis is drawn on the absorption, assimilation, and the egestion. We've looked at the structural adaptation of the small intestine. Now let's focus on the process of absorption, and we'll try and apply some questions and our understanding around how to answer these questions. So let's focus on the process of the absorption of the end products. Remember that the ultimate objective of digestion and chemical digestion is to break down these complex molecules into the simplest monomers, simplest building blocks. So we know that proteins are made up of amino acids, that your carbohydrates are made up of your monosaccharides such as glucose, and that fats are broken down into the fatty acid and the lipid molecules. Now that we've got those digested into the simplest forms, we need to be able to absorb them in the small intestine. Let's look at the fate of these molecules. Right, so when we look at absorption, we can look at each of the monomers and where they are absorbed and whether the process is requiring energy or not. So when the absorption requires energy, we say that it is an active process. When it is purely based on a difference in the concentration gradients between the nutrients in the small intestine and in the blood vessel, then we say that it is a passive process. Active process requires energy. Passive process requires a diffusion gradient between concentrations in two different areas. So let's remember that absorption needs to be efficient, and for efficiency we need to maximize the nutrient absorption. So many of these processes require energy and is an active process. So let's try and consider that when we talk about the absorption. And finally, we need to look at where the absorption takes place in terms of the structure in the small intestine. I want you to also remember that we discussed the structure of the villi, and we spoke about the central blood vessels and the central lacteal that transports. So just have that at the back of your mind as we get into this. So when we look at glucose, guys, glucose is absorbed actively. When I say actively, I mean requiring energy. So those cells lining the villi produce energy in the form of ATP, and that ATP allows for the cells to actively use the transport molecules to transfer glucose from the lumen inside the intestine into the blood system, which is the blood vessels lining the internal villi. So that's an active process, and that is then absorbed into the central capillary network surrounding the internal core of the villus. Amino acids are the result of protein being digested into the simplest building blocks called amino acids. The absorption of amino acids again is an active process. Guys, we need amino acids, and hence we need to actively absorb these so that we can build protein, we can repair cells, and we can form enzymes, because lots of our enzymes are made up of amino acids, which is an active process of absorption. That occurs again through the central capillary, where the amino acids end up moving through our central capillary in the villi. When we talk about glycerol and fatty acids, that's the breakdown of your fats. So when you consume your fats, those are broken down into the building blocks called glycerol and fatty acids. The absorption of that is a passive process, meaning that it now then moves from the villi, the space in the lumen, into the central lacteal passively based on the diffusion gradient, where the concentration is higher there and much lower in the central lacteal, causing the movement into the villi. And that is then absorbed and transported through that central lacteal. We've got to remember that part of a diet, we contain vitamins, minerals, and water. And those are important in the micronutrients in our body. So vitamins are actively as well as passively absorbed based on the concentration in the lumen of the small intestines as well as the need of the body. So you will find that the central blood vessels will transport these vitamins, which are your B12 complexes, and your other micronutrients effectively away. Minerals also are absorbed actively with energy as well as passively based on the diffusion gradient also transported with the blood capillary. And then finally, large amounts of water absorbed in the small intestine, but predominantly in the large intestine where that is maximized. And we see that that is a passive process by osmosis, because remember that osmosis is movement through a membrane from a high water potential through a low water potential to a low water potential, and we see that movement through osmosis. Again, the blood capillaries. So when we look at the structures which take away the absorbed nutrients, apart from fatty acids and glycerol, all other substances are transported via the capillary network in the central villi. So guys, let's have an overview of what we just discussed. So the active absorption requires energy, and that energy comes from the cells which contain mitochondria. And this transports the nutrients are absorbed against the concentration gradient back into the central. So we refer to, there's a difference in the concentration in the core. So if we looked at, that's the lumen and that's the lining. So there's a lower concentration on the middle, but there's a higher concentration in the blood capillaries. So we're now moving substances from low to high. And for that process, you need energy, and hence it becomes an active process. The passive absorption does not require energy and simply based on diffusion, where the substances are moving along from a high concentration to a low concentration, which we see happening in the instance of water and your fats and your lipid, where the concentration of water is much higher in the central of the lumen that then moves in passively based on the diffusion gradient. Let's look at the transport of amino acids and glucose. Glucose and amino acids are the simplest monomers of your carbohydrates and your proteins, and these are absorbed from the small intestine and then transported in the bloodstream to where the cells are needed. Let's look at that in the next diagram. It's important that we understand that glucose is fundamental to all cells having energy. Amino acids, again I mentioned, are the building blocks of enzymes as well as required for the protein synthesis. So these are important in terms of understanding how these are absorbed and then transported. So your amino acids and glucose are absorbed in the central blood capillaries in the villi of the small intestine. From there, these capillaries join together to form larger venules, so veins that are transporting these substances, to form the hepatic portal vein, which then takes it to the liver. They transport the amino acids and glucose to the liver. So vessels that are associated with the liver, again, are referred to as the hepatic vessels. Again, this is a vein, so it's transporting the glucose as well as the amino acids to the liver. What happens in the liver now? So the glucose and the amino acids flow through into the hepatic vein to the heart. From the heart, some of the liver converts the excess glucose and stores it as glycogen. When needed, the liver will then release that as glucose. The excess amino acids, guys, are then deaminated. So the toxic amino groups are removed, and that forms urea, which is a waste product that is then removed from the body through urea as we urinate that. So excess amino acids are deaminated and then released as urea in urine. So the process of assimilation is basically absorbing them into the cells and then producing complex molecules based on the needs of the body. So assimilation is the incorporation of the absorbed nutrients, the building blocks, into the cells of the body. The body cells then absorb these required nutrients which are necessary for building and maintaining larger compounds. So we absorb the amino acids and then we make proteins. For example, your muscle cells will absorb the amino acids from the bloodstream and convert these into proteins. Proteins then will repair and regenerate the muscles. Glucose will then be absorbed by the cells and they will provide the mitochondria with energy for cellular respiration. That in turn produces ATP for cellular metabolism. The liver plays a vital role in the assimilation of nutrients, guys. The liver is responsible for the metabolism of glucose, the removal or the deamination of excess amino acids, so when we remove excess amino acids, as well as the breakdown of alcohol, drugs, and hormones. So the consumption of alcohol again affects the liver because the liver has to carry out extensive detoxification of alcohol. Drugs in the form of medication that we take often is toxic to the body and has to be broken down into less toxic substances and then released through our body. Hormones that are not needed, that have served their function, are then broken down and released through the body. So the liver plays an important role in changing the chemical nature of some of the substances that are not needed and then released through excretion. The role of bacteria in the large intestine. When we look at the large intestine, this is where maximum amount of the absorption of water takes place. It's important that we recognize that the bacteria, there's an active culture or growth of bacteria in our large intestine. Why do we have these bacteria? They play an important relationship in how the absorption and digestion of certain nutrients takes place. So we call this symbiotic bacteria, meaning living together and benefiting us. So we have trillions of bacteria that live in the large intestine. Most of them are helpful. Generally, we need them, and they help us survive. Without them, we would have significant abnormalities in terms of the efficiency at which our digestive system functions. Some of the bacteria produce vitamins, which are absorbed by the large intestine. Okay? Others play an important role in controlling the growth of harmful bacteria. So they break down indigestible food components as well. So some of these bacteria play an important role in attacking and getting rid of harmful bacteria that get into our large intestine. They also produce substances that help prevent colon cancer, antioxidants. They play an important role in breaking down toxins before they can be poisonous to the body. So we've got these symbiotic bacteria that play an important role in our digestion. You would have heard of probiotics that a doctor might suggest that you take. And these probiotics, again, are useful bacteria that help to establish a good intestinal bacteria culture, which plays an important role in assisting our digestive system carry out its function. Finally, the process of egestion. All of the process of digestion has occurred, the chemical breakdown of food has occurred, we've absorbed what we've needed, and we find that we're now left with the waste products. What is present in the waste products? So it's the waste products from what has not been needed, parts that haven't been digested. So you know that plant material cannot be digested. We do not have the enzyme cellulose that breaks down, we don't have the enzyme cellulase that breaks down cellulose. And so we need to ensure that all of those waste products are removed. So egestion is an important process in removing the waste products. If that does not happen, we end up with serious health conditions. We find that there's a buildup of toxins which starts with constipation and then leads to other health complications. So all undigested material are transported through the colon where most water absorption takes place and your mineral salts are absorbed. The undigested material are temporarily stored in the rectum until egested through the anus. The undigested waste is referred to as feces. The removal of the feces outside the body is called defecation. Why is it important to have roughage in our diet? Guys, roughage is important in our diet as it increases bulk and volume. Where does roughage come from? Roughage comes from a diet which is rich in plant material. When you're having your bran flakes and your cereals in the morning, those are important in increasing the volume of movement of food throughout your digestive system. And this increases peristalsis and prevents constipation. So we need to ensure that our diet has a large source of roughage, and that comes from the plant and animal material that we consume. Guys, that's a wrap. I didn't get a chance to get through looking at the application of questions, but I think it's important that when you go through the section that you're able to access questions based on the structure of the villi. Look at how it's structurally adapted for efficient absorption. Look at what happens to the nutrients once they're absorbed in the capillaries and transported. Guys, you've been a fantastic audience. I trust that you've enjoyed the engagement. From me, it's a wrap. See you soon. Have a bye-lekker day. Cheers.